My, good, you're here. I am so excited. Guess what? I hope this isn't about your podcast again. Why, did you finally listen to it?
Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. The Groomer Next Door production. You're listening to BYOTP Radio. Coming up next, the Groomer Next Door. The Groomer Next Door Podcast.
Dun, 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 dun.
Hello, Pups and Kittens, and welcome to another fun-filled episode of the Groomer Next Door. Let me add, from fun-filled, and intellectual episode of the Groomer Next Door. I'm your host, Chris Green, and joining us is the reason why you've all tuned in this week to listen to Daniel Orrego, who is the president of KetoPet Sanctuary, and all around, probably the most brilliant person we've talked to in a while. And we're very lucky. We talked to a lot of brilliant people. But this guy, man, he is brilliant. Let me dive into this week's Fact of the Week. Cancer in pets can occur nearly anywhere in their bodies, from skin to spleen to tissue or lymph nodes. Some of the forms of cancer can be visible to sight and touch, but for catching other forms of cancer, it's important for you to note changes in your pet's habits and dispositions, and to take your pet to the vet regularly. Now, occasionally, from our perspective in the grooming world, we do see little bumps and little things that kind of come out, and we'll kind of see it as the hair comes off. And always tell the pet parent, because maybe they didn't know about it, because again, dog's coming in for a groom, they may have not been to the vet recently, and I think that both Sarah and I would agree on this. It's our job to tell all of you guys that, hey, there might be something different with your pet. And the same thing goes with disposition. Your groomer hopefully tells you at the end of the groom, when you pick up your pup, hey, you know what? Your pup was acting a little strange today. I noticed XYZ. And maybe you've noticed it. Maybe you haven't. It's always best to have that second pair or even third pair of eyes to actually give you that bit of insight into your pet. Now, with that said, let's dive into our weekly roundup.
The weekly roundup, yeehaw.
Hey, look at that. Joining me for this week's weekly roundup is Sarah, rejoining us on the podcast. Hi.
Hi.
Well, the reason why I was like, hey, you know what, want to join me is because this week we actually did an adoption event right here in Rolla, and I'm going to have you kind of tell everybody about it, and then there's a little bit more I'm going to add.
Well, we were asked to come and enjoy the summer days over at the Rolla Library. And, of course, it had to be the absolute hottest day of the year. And we show up, they asked us to bring some pets out there so we can help the adoption and do all these different things, right? We get there, and it is so hot that it was a call about how maybe we should not do this and cancel this event. Luckily, they asked us to come on inside and enjoy the lovely air conditioner.
And it was lovely.
It was so nice. So, brought all the cats in. Well, a bunch of people showed up. They were loving the cats. They enjoyed it. But they were looking for kittens. All right, I got a few kittens. Okay, well, hold on a second. I wasn't bringing the kittens out because I knew it was going to be too hot for them. We brought out Tina, Cashew, and Peanut.
And Giddy.
And Giddy. Tina was, I think, the first one that people were like, nope, she's mine.
Well, yeah, and
that's
that's common.
They called dibs on her. Tina is a long-haired calico. Super sweet, very adorable. She's got a pinched little nose and a narrow face. She's just really super cute and super fluffy. The guy picked her up, and she fell asleep within seconds of being in his arms. Oh, that is amazing. And then Peanut did the same thing in the arms of the mom. And it was just so sweet just to see these cats who don't give care where we are. They were perfectly happy in their arms. So it was quite nice. Tina, Peanut, and Cashew all got adopted. Woohoo! Yay! We still have Giddy. Giddy's so tiny though. I don't want to adopt her out just yet. She's so petite. And she still has a lot to learn. I think before she goes to a new home.
She's like that cheese that they talk about, aged cheese before, not ready. Yeah, that's probably the best analogy for her.
And I think it's best if she hangs out with us for a little bit longer, at least another couple weeks.
Yeah, I agree. I was kind of like, not really ready for her to go. I was prepared, but I was hoping that she wouldn't. And of course, my bad behavior of, I really hope Kitty doesn't go, actually influence somebody to adopt. I forget if it was Cashew or Peanut instead. So that was good for her. My bad behavior worked out really well. So I'm happy. Now, as well, and a lot of people are asking tons of questions about this. We picked up a dog from the Rolla Animal Shelter. That dog was a Blue Heeler, Red Doberman mix. And her name was Sophie. Or is Sophie. A lot of people were wondering about her because I posted the video on the Facebook page. I was driving back. She wasn't adopted. Very energetic pup. I'm not going to go into the full story because there's tons of the story on Facebook now through the live shot that we did today and other stories. But she is looking for a home. And everybody's wondering, well, where do I go? Why isn't she adopted? Give updates. Well, the simple fact is that she is a dog that actually needs a lot of attention. Needs probably one of those types of families that is very exercise driven, that like to go on jogs, long walks, hikes, stuff like that. She would be perfect.
Yeah, she needs an active lifestyle.
Very active.
Find someone that has an active lifestyle.
Right. She, her and I took about a mile walk on Wednesday, and she tuckered out after it. So her energy is there, but luckily with the right amount of exercise, you can actually keep her at a very calm, docile stage. Again, it's going to be a real hard fit for her. She's been adopted and returned, unfortunately, a couple times to the shelter because, well, a lot of people just don't have that time. So, again, I went live today, and I'm hoping, really hoping, that by the time this podcast comes out, she's adopted. And, I did end the podcast, the live video podcast, I guess you want to call it, today, where you actually got to hear her crying as I walked away from the kennel.
How sad.
Well, yeah, it is. It really is sad. And I knew what I was doing when I actually did it because I want you guys to all hear exactly what I heard. And Officer McHugh today was telling me before we actually went live that this morning she was crying a lot. And that really breaks my heart. And I'm really hoping that the awareness was able to, get out there. And you guys have all been great, especially locally. I can't believe the messages that I'm receiving and all the attention that she's getting. And, again, if she's not the right fit for you, I did add a lot of other dogs to the mix. So hopefully somebody, who's looking for a new member of the family will go on down to Rolla Animal Shelter. All right, well, with that, here comes our guest, Daniel Orrego.
Oh, hello. Hold on a sec. Dad, we have a guest on the podcast.
Oh my gosh, I am so glad we get to actually sit down with Daniel Orrego. You're the president of KetoPet. And oh my gosh, we have so much to go over, so much to talk about. I'm so happy to be able to sit down and talk to you.
Hey man, thank you so much for inviting me on. I think this is going to be a fulfilling time together. And you're right. You know, we've got a lot of territory to cover. Why don't you lead me? Tell me where you want to start and all this.
Well, I always like to start in the first place. I love the origin story to everybody. And I want to know the origin story of KetoPet. How did it all start?
Sure. So this goes back to actually a meeting that occurred in, I want to say like mid-2013. And two very important people in the world of ketogenics came to our offices and kind of schooled us on fat metabolism. One guy's name is Peter Attia. Dr. Peter Attia is a physician, also one of the founders of NUSI, the Nutrition Science Initiative. And the other gentleman was a guy named Dom D'Agostino. Dr. Dom D'Agostino is a researcher of University of South Florida. And both of these guys really talked to our team about why fat metabolism is an important part of the metabolic landscape, and beyond that, how it has a role to play in disease mediation. And up to that point, you know, our focus on nutrition had been very performance-based. And what I mean by that is, you know, we were, you know, protein guys. And that was where, you know, we put the balance of our energy, trying to figure out ways to put on lean muscle mass, also lose fat, get leaner at the same time while doing that. So when Peter and Dom came to our offices and really showed us, hey man, there's this whole other world that really revolves around a ketogenic diet. Interestingly, both for performance, but also having therapeutic value, that really and truly changed our thinking about the role that nutrition had to play in managing disease. And it should be said, sort of, you know, in the interest of transparency and disclosure, none of these ideas are particularly new. They were new to us, but they weren't new in terms of the history of research and the history of medicine. What I mean by that is that a ketogenic diet really was developed at Johns Hopkins University back in the 1920s. And in that epoch, and even today, it was used to address seizure in pediatric epilepsy patients. So, you know, kids that would have seizures that perhaps didn't respond to standard drug treatments, they would put them on a ketogenic diet and observe that the frequency and intensity of seizure would lower, and in the best cases, the most favorable cases, abate. And so, you know, you fast forward to the modern epoch, and some of the thinking around the application of a ketogenic diet started to evolve and change. And what I mean by that is that people started asking the question, hey, can we apply these nutritional protocols to addressing obesity, to addressing cognitive decline, perhaps in the form of dementia or Alzheimer's, to addressing diabetes, cardiac disease, as well as cancer? And it was really you know, a small cohort of researchers, particularly a guy named Dr. Thomas Seyfried, that kind of really put a stamp on what a ketogenic diet could be used for, specifically in a glioblastoma model and a brain cancer model. And he looked at that, and he looked at what tumor response could look like in brain cancer while using a ketogenic diet, and started to see a very favorable trend. And so this is what really had a huge impact on us. And we thought to ourselves, okay, well, you know, we're all guys that live in the world of nutrition, and we have an appreciation for it. So guinea pigging ourselves and trying these things on ourselves was, you know, par for the course. And, you know, we were measuring our ketones and our glucose and seeing how a ketogenic diet impacted our metabolism, looking at the performance effect. But we said, you know, how can we validate whether or not this really has an impact on a disease model, you know, and cancer is kind of at the top of that stack. And that's when a colleague of mine, a gentleman by the name of Ron Penna, said, hey, I've got an idea. We can do two really cool things at the same time. I said, okay, well, what is that? He said, look, here's what we're going to do. We know we all love dogs. We're all dog people. We all have dogs. We all love dogs. We spend a lot of time with our dogs. What if we went out? What if we rescued dogs from kill shelters? These are dogs who would otherwise be euthanized because they have cancer. We bring them to a facility where we give them the most spectacular standard of veterinary care, lots of love, high quality of life, and we see if, in fact, a ketogenic meal program can have an impact on disease progression in these dogs. Now, this was something that, to go from idea, to go from concept to execution took us a while. It took us about a year. But in a year time, I think by about October 2014, we opened KetoPet Sanctuary just outside of Austin, Texas, where we have a 53-acre ranch that's dedicated solely to caring for dogs with cancer that we rescue from the local shelters. Not just in that area, but we've rescued dogs from Oregon and Utah and Florida. So we're not limited by state lines. So that was really kind of what got us started, was really Dr. Attia and Dr. D'Agostino put this idea in our minds. And then as a result of having this tremendous affinity for dogs and a tremendous affinity for trying to understand if nutrition can work in both a human model and a canine model, that was our point of departure. And that's what brings us here today. Wow.
And see, I'm going through it. I'm like, okay, you got the sanctuary open in 2014. All of this took place, if I'm doing the math correctly, 2013, 2012. Is that sound about accurate, or was it before then?
Well, some of these ideas actually came across our desk in part. And what I mean by that is that we've always had a focus on metabolism. And specifically, we began learning about Warburg effect way back in 2012. And if you're not familiar with that, in I think 1926 or so, a guy named Otto Warburg, who was a scientist, made a very simple observation, which was he was able to observe that the primary fuel substrate of tumor tissue was glucose. And he looked at this in a couple of different tumor lines. And correspondingly, he also saw if you limit that substrate, tumor regression slows down. And he wrote about this. In fact, he won a Nobel Prize for the body of work that he did around that. So those were some of the underlying principles that really made us focus on this. But these existed as ideas. It really wasn't until really early 2014 that we started diligently trying to assemble this project and all its component parts. And it really wasn't easy. And what I mean by that is that, we really wanted to try to understand if a nutritional intervention in the form of a ketogenic diet really, in fact, could impact cancer. And so, we had to go out and get our own PET CT scanner. That was a whole ordeal. We had to coalesce a group of veterinarians, veterinary technicians, specialists, people from the human medical community, people from the academic community to help buttress and support what we're doing and offer guidance. Because, at the end of the day, we weren't really the natural owners of this space. We just knew we wanted to help dogs and try to understand if nutrition could be a cofactor in helping them get through their illness.
It's funny as you're talking about this. I'm hearing you say everything on this. Pretty much the research came out of the 1920s. Which does this seem a little strange though, that we had such, I don't know if I want to say great minds, great research, or what, but it seems like there's such a cutoff. I mean, I get the Great Depression. That's happening in the 1920, 1930, right around that area. And of course, you're going to have a drop off. But even when you think back, 1950s, 60s, and so on, it seemed like there had been this almost mute had been put on science. So all your research is back then, and then even now, I mean, it's kind of weird. I pay attention to the science of health, rejuvenation, even down to cancer, and it seems like there had been no, I mean, I hate to say, but no research or at least development that had gone public. And I'm, listening to you go at 1920, and I'm thinking, here's all this research, and yet we've still, quote unquote, not, found this cure. And I'm thinking, no, we have to have a cure. As you're picking different things out, pushing the button, saying, here's this, here's that. It shocks me as I'm going through this. It's bizarre.
Well, you bring up some legitimate concerns, and it should be said that the idea that learning about metabolism or intervening in metabolism is a way to manage disease did continue to progress in the sciences between the 20s and the modern epoch. It never became part of the common lexicon for oncologists. It's sort of something that's studied and learned, but not applied clinically to the degree perhaps that it could be. So it's been a little bit of a slow burn, to be sure. And it's really in the last, I would say, 6 to 8 years that's kind of turned the corner. And in large part because there's just more studies, there's just more data to look at. And I'll give you specific examples. Like, for example, Dr. Adrienne Scheck at the Barrows Institute in Arizona, she's done a wonderful job of looking at the correspondence between a ketogenic diet and radiation therapy in a brain cancer model and comparing those outcomes to groups that only receive radiation therapy. That's very important work because she's showing that, hey, there can be a synergistic effect between a metabolic intervention and a standard radiation intervention. And there's other players out there that are advancing that work as well. So those are some things that continue to progress. And now, finally, in 2017, there's actually more backing, if you will, for this kind of research. And that's always been, I think, particularly in the last 20 years, there has been some tension, and I think you've astutely articulated some components of this between the somatic theory of cancer and the metabolic theory of cancer, right? The somatic theory of cancer being a focus on genetics, the metabolic theory of cancer being more of a focus on epigenetics. And so there is some tension between those two schools of thought. The good news is both are contributing towards our advancing our understanding of cancer and ultimately, hopefully, as you point out, moving us towards an ability to manage cancer, not just as an acute disease, but as a chronic disease, and ultimately, and it's always trepidatious to use this word, but ultimately to reach for that very, very high bar and be able to use the word cure. We're not there yet, but that's certainly the target, and we're seeing more and more that addressing tumor metabolism is part of that landscape.
I'm going to say it in the easiest way I can. All of this starts in its own language, so to speak. So, we start off with everything that you're talking about that starts in the 20s, and it became its own language. And then it just kind of grew words and sentences and paragraphs and so on and so on. And I get it. I'm 36, and I remember in the 90s, that's when you started to really see people talk about cancer. And it became this, okay, well, we kind of have a verbiage to it. And now it's like, I really, I think that there's an obvious cure here. And I know using the worst word possible, but there is a cure because at least we have a road to go down. And what's great for everybody who's listening is that we're not just talking, human. I mean, this is very common in our dogs. Our pets do get cancer. And this is the greatest way of really seeing it and studying it and being able to find a cure for them and for us. I mean, it really binds the two together, which is, again, why I said, before we started recording, this is why it's so great to be able to have this conversation, because as you're talking, I'm going, I totally get that. I understand the language you're talking, which is the science of how to at least condense and minimize cancer, I guess would be the best way, what you're trying to say here. And you do have state-of-the-art technology at the sanctuary, which is kind of where I wanted to kind of segue to is, as you're mentioning the sanctuary, why don't we actually go into all about the sanctuary and tell us about it? And even furthermore, why Texas? Why was that the location picked? Because obviously we have a ton of other states, but I have an idea why, but I'll let you go with that. And, you mentioned, Johns Hopkins, but another leading university, I would think, for medical is, and right in the backyard there is, you have UCLA. So I just throw all that out there and kind of say, here's a bunch of things to kind of answer, but go with it.
Sure. Well, it was pretty simple. There's a pretty simple background to why we ended up in Texas. And that really had to do with the acquisition of our primary imaging modality, which is the PET CT scan. That's positron emission tomography combined with computerized tomography. Now, that's a very common imaging modality in human oncology, much less so in veterinary oncology. And the reason why we were interested in that is because the PET component of that imaging combination allows you to get insight into the metabolic state of a given tumor. And that's described by what's called a standard uptake value. And that standard uptake value, the metric that's associated with it, gives you some insight into the intensity of metabolic function within a particular tumor. And that's something where while it does exist in some academic studies in veterinary medicine, the literature is pretty thin there. So what our intention there was to apply to veterinary medicine the same standards that are common in human medicine. And that was our point of departure. And what we realized in short order is getting the licensure that was required to do that in Southern California, where most of our working group is based, was very, very cumbersome and difficult. Mm-hmm. And it was really through the connection of some friends and colleagues in the state of Texas who had some influence at the governor's office that we were able to fast track something that normally takes 2 years in 21 days. And so that's what ultimately put us in Texas. And we're very, very happy that was the case, because we also recognize that Texas, along with California, has a huge problem with a huge challenge with dogs in shelters. A lot of those dogs don't get rescued, and we saw in very short order that we had a role to play in that regard, because dogs that go into a shelter oftentimes are on a very short list. Mm-hmm. If that dog has a lump or a bump, boy, they're on an even shorter list for euthanasia. And so, our offer was simply this: look, give us a call. Don't put down that dog. Give us an opportunity to diagnose precisely what's going on. We've got partnerships with phenomenal veterinary oncologists that will help us do that. And we found some interesting things right off the bat, that many of the dogs that we rescued didn't have cancer. They had skin tags, they had dermal lesions, they had fatty lipomas, and we were able to actually do some very minor cosmetic surgeries and get those dogs rescued out to phenomenal families that love the dog, and the dog's having a wonderful life. So we're able actually to contribute mightily to pulling some dogs out of shelters who would have been put down because they were thought to have cancer, and in many instances those shelters really didn't have the resources to do the formal diagnostics. Now, on the other hand, for the dogs that we rescue that do have cancer, their KetoPet Sanctuary provides a forever home. And of course, our focus is on making sure that they receive the highest standard of veterinary care, along with all the nutritional components and the other things that we offer.
And see, that's amazing. And right there, Texas is a different entity to any other of the 49 states. That's for sure. Their laws are much different. Their structure is completely different than everywhere else, and that's why I was like, I can kind of see why it was chose as the actual sanctuary home. But the fact is what you're nailing right there is the fact that there are states right next to it too, New Mexico, Arizona, even Texas, that have very short windows. I mean, we're talking 7 days in some shelters in some states to up to 21. Mm-hmm. So you really did make a major impact and probably saved quite a lot of lives. That right there is commendable. If anything, let's start with that. Not to mention the science that's behind all this. I personally will go with the fact that, and I think it's safe to say, and I said this before we even started recording again, I honestly and this is where I now will reach out to everybody who's listening. This is where you need to go to their website. I mean, I will have all details on the actual show page, but I think it's safe to say you have the top facility in the country and, close to, if not the world, when it comes to cancer research. And yes, we're talking about within pets, but the problem I don't think a lot of people see is it has to start somewhere. Your research is probably in the front line right now. And that is amazing.
Yeah, if there's any contribution that we've made is really just taking the protocols that were used in human oncology and porting those over to canines. And so taking the same nutritional programs that were used in brain cancer patients and essentially reformulating those so that they're appropriate for doggies. And, it should be said, KetoPet's primary interest is obviously on the rescue side of things. And, in the sense that, and what I mean by that is in the formal sense, KetoPet really isn't a research institution. And what I mean by that is that we don't use controls. Our data is anecdotal. And part of that is because we take on all comers. In other words, we don't say this cancer, not that cancer. Mm-hmm. We say all cancers. We don't say this breed, not that breed. We say all breeds. We don't say just young dogs, not old dogs. We say all dogs. So in that sense, what our data really does is it offers, prospective veterinary oncologists and ultimately even human oncologists insight into a case series that's very compelling that shows, look, when you try to apply these protocols in the real world, here are some of the results that you can anticipate. And the good news is we've been very diligent about acquiring pathology and imaging and all the background information you would need from a diagnostic perspective to put a pretty fine point on what the health outcomes are. And we did see a spectrum of response. And this is where kind of like it's really the meat and potatoes of the story, right? Because people always say, well, did the dogs make it? And the answer is, well, not all dogs. And
right.
What I mean by that is that here's basically what we saw. I kind of jumped to the punchline. When you're dealing with later stage cancers, your stage 3, stage 4 cancers, or your very aggressive cancers, you really don't see a big reversal. But what you do observe is an interesting phenomenon, which is the progression of disease, the metastatic progression of the cancer can slow down a little bit, and in the most favorable cases kind of halt. And this is done while preserving a very high quality of life. In particular, if you're dealing with a dog that has a non-resectable tumor or a type of cancer that really doesn't respond to chemotherapy, you're able to offer them a very, very high quality of life with a low side effect profile. Now, the story gets more interesting when you're dealing with very, very early stage cancers. Sometimes you can see a reversal, maybe with the stage 1 cancer. You can see on the PET CT scan that those tumors do go away. But what we're really interested in, and this is why KetoPet Sanctuary is set up as a forever home, is that we'll take care of these doggies in perpetuity and continue to observe them. So one of the most compelling things about KetoPet Sanctuary is, when somebody asks, well, what happened to that dog? I saw a case on your website, or I saw this dog had mast cell tumor or squamous cell carcinoma or hemangiosarcoma. What happened to that dog? I said, well, there's the dog. You can come play with it. And that for us is sort of the barometer that we use is what's the overall survivorship? And most importantly, what's the quality of life? Is this dog thriving? Is this dog excited? Is this dog running around playing? Is this dog enjoying its surroundings? And so that's really the big takeaway for us is when we can see a dog persist, even when disease is still present and have a super high quality of life, we'll count that as a win.
And see that right there, here we go back to where I started with the verbiage. You have just extended that exact thing. You're adding. You really aren't jumping to the end there. You're more or less substantiating it, where you're saying, okay, well, we have found a way to extend this new language that is cancer. And yes, I do realize more people are going to be more focused, hyper-focused, and it's not even on my list of things I wanted to ask is, well, what's your survival rate? That wasn't what I was even going to go with, because I realized, again, this is still a science that has not really been, fully understood. I mean, here we go. Let's go back again. We're talking about things that were, brought to a head in the 1920s, and pieces are going to be put together. And you said it best. You didn't create the science, but you learned from it. Where, let's be realistic, majority of scientists have not. How many times have you read or seen some doctor says, oh, I know all that there is to know about cancer, and it's this way, and it's completely recreated with none of the little attributes or parts of language that have brought us to where we are today. So I commend you on that, and I hate it. Personally hate when people are just going to ask, what's the survival ratio. That drives me nuts. Because that's just,
Sure.
They're just looking for a reason to actually almost downsize it or dismiss it completely.
Well, and you bring up a couple of substantive points there. And by the way, just as a note, for folks who are interested in the data, we do present the case series. We did it last year at the Metabolic Therapeutics Conference, and also a second cohort we presented the data on this year at the Metabolic Therapeutics Conference at University of South Florida. So for people who are interested in looking at that data, it is available, I believe, on YouTube and Facebook. So you can find that, and it is an interesting story. But more broadly, I think I can intuit a little bit where you're going here. Oncologists, whether it's a human oncologist or a veterinary oncologist, they are frustrated when they can't practice their best medicine or they can't practice their most effective medicine. And that's where I see the landscape changing, because while we don't know everything we want to know about a ketogenic diet, and we don't know everything we want to know about how nutrition impacts disease, because we're starting to build an inventory of compelling case studies both in the human world and the canine world, establishment medicine is starting to look at that and go, well, if there's something here, how can we incorporate it? And I'll give you a good example. We did a small pilot study last year at Cedars-Sinai here in LA with brain cancer patients, where we gave a small cohort. It was about like 9 patients a ketogenic diet, and then did the same thing. We looked at the imaging, in this case MRI, and said, hey, can we get a tumor response? And in fact, we presented some of that data at the Metabolic Therapeutics Conference this year as well. And it's a very interesting landscape, because what you see is that here again, you have the same situation. This isn't a formal study. You have a varying cohort of different cancers, different tumor models, and different stages of therapy. Some had failed chemotherapy, some hadn't started it, some were in immunotherapy trials. So these aren't perfect controls, but what you see that's interesting is that you get responses that aren't anticipated. And that's what's intriguing, and that's why physicians and neuro-oncologists are looking at this and saying, hey, look, if I can add a ketogenic diet as sort of a do-no-harm adjuvant to my standard protocols and get better outcomes, there's not really a downside. And that's where the thinking is now starting to evolve to.
And see, that's the whole thing, though, because at least they're looking at the data, and that's what gets me. It's like, well, at least we've got something. And I love that, and I love the science to it. But again, you say it best. Yeah, it's nerve wracking that they can't, a vet, which it's got to be hard. Here you have an actual doctor and you have a veterinarian. The actual structure, the anatomy of a human and dog are similar, but they are far apart at the same time. And you have both sides going, racking your brain. I know there's top scientists and top doctors out there doing it, but the part that I look at is we're so far, but we're so close, and it gets me. It still gets me to this day. And talking to you, it's like I feel like we're right there. We're on the cusp of it, and yet it's a code. Just can't break it. And I'm always interested to talk to people that are as intelligent as you are, because I'm like, oh gosh, but we're so close. And then, it's like, well, we're really not. It's like, oh damn, I completely read that wrong. But then, there's so much hope in what you say, and I just kind of go, well, no, we are close then. I guess I'm one of those that just want to always believe we're right there, especially when it comes to cancer. It's just such a cruel disease that you just think it should be gone by now. And again, here we go back to in the 20s we had, some research. Yeah, let's go with that. Now, something I'm curious about is what's metabolic conditioning?
Sure. So in a way, that's a fancy term for exercise. But and what I mean by that is what we're trying to get to with Metcon is the following. And again, this is something that we have to do more validation on. But here's the thinking, right? If the whole function and point of a ketogenic meal program is to lower blood glucose, increase serum levels of ketones, and essentially lower the systemic availability of the substrate, namely carbohydrate or sugar or glucose, however you want to characterize that, the fuel substrate that cancer preferentially takes in, then can you goose that function of the diet by also increasing rigorous exercise? And what I mean by that is there's always going to be some level of systemic glucose availability. Can you partition that nutrient away from the cancer and burn it as energy while exercising? Right now, there's been some tracer studies that show some of this, but there's a whole landscape of further work that has to be done to see does exercise in fact play a major role. Now, one of the things that we saw just generally, and we continue to see to this day, because the two things that we do with our dogs, one is we exercise them very rigorously and very consistently, but we also have really doubled down on dog training. And the reason is because dog training allows a dog to work, which gives them a very high quality of life. It gives them mental and emotional stimulation, and it also gives them reward, right? When a dog performs a training action well, he's rewarded. This is a good thing in his life. And we see that both of these things impact the quality of life for a doggy so highly. And there's a big landscape here. And what I mean by that is not every dog that we rescue is an Olympic specimen. A 10-pound Chihuahua, isn't going to run like a greyhound. Some of the dogs that we rescue are older dogs, so they may have hip dysplasia, or they may have some arthritis, or a wobbler syndrome, or even a cruciate ligament tear. We still scale exercise and training for what they can do. So some of those older dogs, they may get a little bit of treadmill work or water therapy a couple times a day. And that still gives them that interaction. We help them do training in ways that they can. And so we modulate and adjust this program to each individual dog according to their needs and based on what they can do.
Now, when you say treadmill, I'm going to throw a question into that. Treadmill or are we talking about aquatic treadmill?
Both, really. Like, some dogs really can't go on a standard treadmill, and you need that displacement that the water treadmill offers. So, we can make that adjustment. The other thing is some dogs just like to jump in a pool and swim. That's another, it's not quite an aquatic treadmill, but allows them to exercise while having some of the weight, the load bearing elements of exercise removed for them. So, there's a lot of adjustments that you can make, given, where a dog's at, health wise.
Every time I think about aquatic treadmill opposed to just regular, standard treadmills, I always feel like aquatic it's harder, exercise to do, but easier on the body. And I think of it as, in human form. But then again, I come back and I look at it from the actual standpoint of an animal, the dog, and I'm thinking, okay, well, obviously go back to anatomy and how they age so much different than us. I mean, 7 years for every one. I'm like, oh, it's got to be a lot better for them if it's aquatic. But, like you said, I mean, if they're swimming around, it's still good. Swimming around is still an exercise. It's anything to keep them going, right? And it's like the other thing that I took out of all that is, again, you're right now West Coast, and what drives me insane is being, formerly from Los Angeles my entire life up until the last 7 years. I've only seen the lifespan of the West Coast. Now, obviously, you do commute a lot, so you probably see this a lot. But man, that gray spot right down the Midwest, where there isn't that exercise, there isn't all of that training that should be going in, drives me insane. It's Midwest is all the dark spot, and West Coast, East Coast, they have the different mindset. where it's training and it's exercise and et cetera, et cetera. I don't see that here. And that's one thing I always try to do, is try to encourage it. Nutrition, and exercise. The two things that our dogs really need. And yet they don't seem to get it here. It bothers me. And I'm on a tangent. That's why I usually have to write notes for myself, because I'll do that.
No worries. But, I will say you bring up a great point, because it's true that a lot of trends do start on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that even in the middle of the country, there's a greater and greater appreciation for this. And it kind of brings up an interesting issue, which is the intersection of canine and human health, right? So
mm-hmm.
in many instances, both people and dogs can benefit from the same approach to nutrition
mm-hmm.
and the same approach to exercise. And it's something that we've kind of coined as, maybe it's not we haven't coined it, but the term that we use is companion health. Right, which is, there's a lot of people out there, man, they'll do anything for their doggies. Their doggies are their children, but maybe they may not, do the same for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we talk about. We say, look, just in the same way that you have a great appreciation for the health of your dog, the fitness of your dog, that can also apply to people. And there's something really cool about this idea that dogs and people can essentially have overlapping nutritional goals applied in slightly different fashions, obviously, and overlapping fitness goals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we've ended up talking a lot about, because we receive so many requests at KetoPet Sanctuary a week, and oftentimes a conversation will start in regards to somebody's furry friend and end with them. So, well, I want to try this. Can people do a ketogenic diet? Yeah, sure. It started with people. And so that's been a very interesting trajectory, and something that we've seen actually grow. And we get a lot of calls from people who actually, I'm on a ketogenic diet. I want to apply that to my dog. How do I do it?
Right. And see, that was kind of when I'm doing my homework on all this, I kind of knew going into this that this was going to be more of a conversation that wasn't just going to stop with our dogs, but was going to actually be full spectrum. It's like, right. This is going to work not only in the mindset for your dogs, it's also you. It's something that you're going to share, at least in the mindset, something that you're going to value together, and hopefully open up minds. Because the simple side, I mean, it's kind of what it is. Now, when I say Midwest, I'm going to do a clarification. Chicago is obviously front center, very much like Los Angeles. So they're excluded from that. But as you know, there's a lot of Illinois that's kind of open landscape, almost sandbox-like in a video game, if you want to go with that. And there's parts of Texas that are exactly the same, very cutting edge, and they're doing the same thing. I'm just talking about a lot of open landscape where there is the old school mentality, where it's dogs are property, and that's as far as it goes. And that's what drives me insane. And so I wanted to clarify on that one. Because a lot of people are like, well, there's good places in the Midwest. You're right. But are they of cutting edge? Now, the next thing that I've always found this one device to be the most interesting devices, whether it's human or even canine. And I think I'm not sure if you use it for cats, because I didn't get that far, but you have a hyperbaric chamber. And I just think that that's the coolest thing in this world. And I wanted to know more, because I know only a little bit, and I'm pretty sure I probably know maybe as much as everybody else. And I just wanted to know details.
Sure. So, the use of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, again, really isn't particularly new. It's been used for a long time to help diabetics address symptoms of neuropathy. So if they've lost blood flow in their extremities, they'll go into a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, which is simply a chamber that increases the partial pressure of oxygen and helps to perfuse oxygen into tissue. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the reason we became interested in it, and this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, it was really Dr. Dom D'Agostino who saw, hey, there might be a synergistic effect between the use of a ketogenic diet and hyperbaric oxygen therapy in addressing brain cancers. And he did it in a glial model in rats. And when we looked at that data, we said, wow, that's pretty impressive, because the delta between, a standard Western diet, a ketogenic diet, and then a ketogenic diet plus hyperbaric oxygen therapy was pretty significant. And so we said, well, can we replicate that in order to help the doggies? And that was really our point of departure. And we learned some very, very interesting things from that, not the least of which is many of the dogs who came to us at KetoPet Sanctuary would come to us post-surgery, or they would come to us and we would have to perform a debulking surgery or a resection of a tumor. The use of the hyperbaric oxygen chambers really cut the convalescence from those surgeries in about half. Mm-hmm. So, that was extremely powerful. The other thing, too, that we noticed is it helped them recover very, very quickly from the effects of anesthesia. So if they had to go under for a procedure, if you put them in the hyperbaric oxygen both before and after that, you'd see them go through a much faster recovery process. Other thing that was really, really interesting is that and there's actually some good research out there in the literature that shows this. We noticed in the cases where radiation was used, provided that hyperbaric oxygen therapy was applied, the most egregious effects of the radiation were dramatically mitigated. So the blistering, lesions, inflammation, and swelling that sometimes can be attendant to radiation therapy really didn't present. And this was a great thing for the doggies. It also meant that their response to radiation was much better. And so that, again, was something that we were able to observe in the dogs that had already sort of been established to some degree in the scientific literature. So the hyperbaric oxygen therapy really and truly had a pretty dramatic role to play in how we work with these dogs. And what's interesting now is you're starting to see that hyperbaric oxygen therapy in veterinary medicine is starting very slowly but surely to become more commonplace. It's not every day. It's not ubiquitous, but there's much more attention on that, particularly, like I said, for addressing recovery and cutting that convalescence time down when it comes to surgery. Now, we weren't really able to validate to the degree that we wanted how much that was impacting their cancers, but we could see that, boy, oh boy, hyperbaric oxygen therapy really and truly has a big role to play when it comes to systemic health. And so, the fact that that's part of our protocol and part of our program has been really, really interesting and really instructive for us.
Again, I'm going to sit here, and I've done this a couple times. I'm sitting here going, I'm at a loss for words, because you just kind of nailed every aspect of that. And I just kind of going, it's really everything. I don't know where to go with that. It's so to point. And that's what gets me, it's such an asset to recovery. And it's like, I didn't know to the extent of science to where you're going. I was just more like, I know it helps in recovery. That's the most I know. I didn't know it helped with anesthesia. I knew the little bits on cells, but it's, I look at that and I go, you took a piece of, again, back to the whole verbiage. You took verbiage that you heard of, you added it to the language, and here you go. It's a big puzzle piece that I think you found all the pieces and you're putting them together, and it's really making sense now of what the design of that puzzle is starting to shape up to. And I'm amazed by it. So, I love that. Let's go into nutrition, because obviously that's exactly what we're here for, even though I want to continue to go into the real deep side of the science to this, but I really want to hit the actual nutrition. And tell us about keto. Now, I know we've been talking about the ketogenics and the ketosis.
Sure. So, one of the things that's interesting is that being in a state of ketosis was actually fairly normative for both doggies and people prior to agriculture. So, the example that I like to give is, you go back 10,000 years before agriculture, you go out, you throw the spear, you didn't get anything. Well, now you're in ketosis. Why? Because there's no energy going in. So your liver spins up ketone bodies and starts drawing from fat reserves on the body.
Mm-hmm.
That's the case for people and for doggies. And then once you go get something, well, now you drop out of ketosis because you've had a big meal, and this fast and this feast and famine cycle would bring people in and out of a state of nutritional ketosis. So that used to be a pretty normal state for doggies and humans. Now you fast forward to today, it's pretty tough to go into ketosis because doggies at home and people at home have the ability to sit on their couch and eat whatever they want. So being in ketosis today is not particularly common. And it should be noted, too, that when we talk about nutritional ketosis, we're talking about a metabolic state that is separate and distinct from ketoacidosis. And it's important to sort of articulate what the differences are. Ketoacidosis is an aberration of metabolism that's represented by very, very high ketones in the presence of very, very high glucose. Whereas ketosis is a metabolic state represented by modestly high ketones in the presence of modestly low glucose. So two very different metabolic states. Ketoacidosis is a problem, very dangerous. Ketosis is a normal metabolic state, although most people don't experience it in the modern epoch. And so really the background and function of using nutritional ketosis is essentially, we know that if we go into a fasted state where there's no energy, we'll drop into ketosis. The question becomes, how do we remain in ketosis while taking in energy? In other words, while eating food. Part of that is caloric control. The other part of that is managing very carefully the distribution of macronutrients, whereby you rely more heavily on fat, you have a very modest amount of protein, and virtually no carbohydrate. And with that combination of making sure that you control calories and you manage your distribution of macronutrients, you can maintain a state of nutritional ketosis for as long as you want. And ultimately, doing that, at least in the case of seizure or epilepsy, diabetes, cognitive decline, obesity, cardiac disease, and cancer, can have an impact on those disease models.
Well, ketosis, I mean, if you think about it, we live in a world of gluttony, really. I don't think it's really possible right now. I mean, yes, there are cases where, I'm reading into it this way, where obviously you're unable to financially have that gluttony where I'm going to McDonald's and I'm eating fast food and I'm just pigging out. Obviously that's what the main amount of people I can see where that would be, where it's almost impossible. But we're not fishing with spears, as you said, anymore. We just go to our local market and we pick up our food, and there we go. So it seems almost kind of almost non-existent in human right now, which is kind of sad. Well, I'm kind of not sad, actually, kind of good. Now in dog world, I can see that where a dog is running around and trying to actually scavenge for food. And same thing with cats. Even though cats are better hunters, they'll find something. So then that's how I'm reading it. I just think that's just kind of crazy. And I was going to ask you the difference between ketosis and ketoacidosis, but you kind of threw that one in there. I was like, oh wow, okay. So, you know exactly where I'm going, don't you?
Well, and you bring up an interesting point. You're right. Being in a state of ketosis, whether through lack of food or through eating ketogenically, isn't common. But in some domains, that's starting to change. And what I mean by that is a lot of athletes now are looking at a ketogenic lifestyle is something that can really help them in the training cycle. And what I mean by that is for endurance sports like triathlons, cycling, ultra marathoning, there's some pretty big advantages to fat burning. One is that you have a sustained energy over a longer period of time in comparison to using carbohydrate. The other thing is that eating ketogenically lowers inflammation dramatically because you don't have those high sugars inducing a big insulin response. So a lot of athletes use it as a way to recover, a way to increase their endurance, and also a way to manage weight, because one of the things that's very satisfying about eating a ketogenic diet is it's incredibly satiating. You know, when you're eating higher fat, you're really not particularly hungry. And so that's even tipped over into the quote unquote weight loss world or fat loss world, where people say, hey, look, you know, I want to try to lose some fat. And counterintuitively, they're eating a higher fat diet to do that, with the understanding that it's really the high carbohydrates that induce an insulin response, which is ultimately what stores fat. And so by eating ketogenically, you see a lot of people now having very, very successful attempts at losing fat, in some cases quite dramatically. So some of that is starting to change. And of course, as often the case, it's really the world of athletics that's driving that and bringing attention to it.
You know, as you said that, I went, you know, okay, these are very small percentage, but then as you're going on, I'm thinking, well, you know what? You're leaving out, there are actors and actresses, and I would even go as far as supermodels would be in that same class, you know, of, we want to make sure it's very strict diet, very just deliberate. And, you know, they're getting everything that they need to have. And that's going to, again, where you said fat burning, that would work there too. As you're going, I'm just thinking on top of my head.
No, absolutely. And you're right. I think it's gaining a popularity in those domains because people can see the benefits quite quickly. Mm-hmm. And so that is sort of quote unquote trending, as they say. And, you know, as far as, you know, applying that to doggies, I would say there's less awareness there, only because, you know, most people are making consumer choices when it comes, you know, this pet food or that pet food. And it's not common for people to think, oh, you know, I'll just compose my doggie's meal program at home and feed them fresh food. There's more awareness growing in that area, and more veterinarians are starting to look at that. But feeding a dog ketogenically certainly hasn't reached the same levels of popularity as ketogenics have in the human world.
Yeah, I'm starting, and as we're going through this conversation, I'm starting to really remember, especially over this last part, I'm really starting to remember reading different things about different high octane athletes. You know, more, you know, your football, your hockey, anything that has something a lot of endurance needed. I've been reading a lot into that as the last couple of years have gone on. As we continue to talk, I'm processing that and almost bringing them back up in file. Now, something that I ask everybody, especially people who are involved in nutrition, it has become, I would say, to some people that listen to the show, or even people who have been on, they'll kind of find it funny because I have a specific term for it, and it's called soapboxing. When you go into a big box store market and you see somebody, and again, there is no right or wrong answer for this. I just always love to know from your perspective. When you go into a big box store, grocery store, whatever it is, or even, you know, doesn't really matter, and you see somebody with just garbage dog food, cat food, whatever it is, do you ever just kind of go over and just start a conversation of, hey, did you know what's in that product?
Well, you know, you bring up a great topic here, because I should say this, there's a couple different considerations when it comes to this that are worth pursuing and talking about, not the least of which is the economic side of this.
Yes.
And, you know, I think we all have to be just sort of forthright and transparent about the fact that, hey, you know, it's a universal constant that pet parents want to do the best they can for their doggy. That's always true. I mean, you know, there's some exceptions to that, and there are some nefarious people out there who don't who don't hold that, but most parents want to see their dogs flourish and thrive. And sometimes the gating factor there is there's a limitation on resources. So, it's tough to be punitive about that when, sometimes that's just a reality that people face. But it doesn't mean that there's not a conversation there, and it doesn't mean that there's not room for evolving that circumstance. And I'll give you a good example of what I mean. Oftentimes, we'll get calls at KetoPet and say, hey, we love what you're doing. We've read about your stuff. We really want to get involved. But when I looked at the cost of getting these meats or these fats and putting those, man, I just can't swing that. What can I do? What can I do? And one of the first things that people can do to address longevity and health in their dogs is to take a keen look at caloric control. And I'll give you the background on this. It's a well understood scientific constant that if you control calories, whether it's for a flatworm or a bird or a monkey or a person or a dog, if you control calories for that organism over their lifespan, that organism will not only live longer than the average, but when they're older, they will behave and appear younger. And that's something that's been very, very well understood in the sciences for a long time. So the question becomes, hey, look, if there's an economic cofactor here and I have to buy, your regular dog food at a Costco or a Sam's Club or something like that, right? What happens when you take half of the kibble that you would normally serve and replace that with, say, a fresh green bean or a fresh cabbage or some low glycemic fiber? Mm-hmm. Well, you've accomplished a couple of things. One is you've controlled calories. You've reduced calories to a degree. But you've also done another thing, which is very important, which is you've introduced a little bit of fiber. Not a lot, but a modest amount. Fiber ferments in the lower gut, which in turn produces butyrate. Butyrate is an insulin-mediating agent, which in turn controls metabolism. That's a very important effect. Mm-hmm. So even when you have a situation like the one that you described where maybe somebody doesn't have access to or the ability to work with fresh foods, there's always something you can do. There's always a point of departure where you can make a change on behalf of your dog that ultimately will serve them in the long term.
And it's funny. I'll give an example. I told only a couple people, and not on the podcast. I was at a Walmart, and there was a lady looking at cat food, big name cat food. And I just kind of was standing there, and you could tell she was studying it. And she goes, my cat doesn't throw up using this. It's good for my cat. And I'm willing to spend the $20 for this bag of cat food. I think 14-pound bag of kibble. Unaware that the kibble actually, has strong effects for dehydration, et cetera, et cetera. I pulled out one of the, I think it was like a 12 or some pound bag of the lower end at $10. And I just went down the list and showed the same thing that's in your $22 bag of the same brand, but considerably what it's called their higher product had the same exact ingredients. And you know what? At the end of the conversation, she goes, but my cat doesn't throw up. So, you're not going to win all the battles, but at least you had that conversation. So that is my little version of a soapbox. I do it occasionally. As some people would say, maybe occasionally too many times, and I would say my wife would be the one that would say that. But people that are in the pet community that have been on the podcast, they find that funny because I do it a little bit more often than I should. So that's my sharing of it. But I always wanted to ask that question because there is, again, no wrong answer. Now, a question that is kind of interesting that I think I have the answer for, but again, reason why I ask is because, you know what? It's never hurtful to actually ask questions. And that is, how long can my dog remain on a ketogenic meal plan?
Sure. So that's actually a crucial consideration. And the answer is this. There's really different versions of ketogenic meal plans. And what I mean by that is the version that you might elect to use to address an acute problem like, say, obesity or diabetes or cancer would be very different than what you can sort of euphemistically call a lifestyle diet for an adult dog. And that really has to do with really two cofactors. One is the amount of caloric density that you're offering that doggy. For an adult active dog, it may be a little higher. As well, the ketogenic ratio that you're using, which describes the gram amount of fat in relation to the gram amount of protein plus carbs. So in a disease model, you may want to use a higher ketogenic ratio, but in a lifestyle model, you may want to use a much lower ketogenic ratio. And really the purpose of that is to modulate up and down the amount of protein that's available to the doggy. And changing those ratios allows you to do that. And that's something that we see over the long term with the doggies that we take care of at KetoPet, right? Those doggies may start on a given nutritional program using a ketogenic meal plan, but that will evolve and change over time according to their needs and according to where they are in managing their disease. So, and that's actually a very, very important point in regards to a ketogenic diet. It's really not a set it and forget it meal plan. It's not really a recipe. It's really an approach to controlling metabolism, and you have to make adjustments and take into consideration the response of the dog and the needs of the dog over time. And as a result, you'll see yourself sort of tweaking and modulating how that nutritional program is presented to the doggy.
Now, one of my last questions is, how does a pet parent transition from just say regular store-bought big brand kibble to KetoPet?
Sure. Well, the good news is, for those pet parents that are out there say, hey, you know what, I think I want to try this ketogenic diet. It's not something that you have to do all at once. And what I mean by that is if a dog's accustomed to eating a store kibble, there may be a period of adjustment to get them cut over to raw foods. That may be a 6, 7, 8 day trajectory where you're very slowly replacing a portion of what you would normally serve them in the kibble form factor with your fresh ketogenic form factor. And that's okay because, just in the same way that, a person might be accustomed to eating a certain way over time, it may take them, a week or so to get accustomed to a new modality of eating. So it's not something you have to do all at once, and taking your time and very, very slowly and judiciously cutting over usually will serve you well in two respects. One, you're sort of preempting, any stomach upset that might occur, and also you're getting a doggy accustomed to interacting with a whole new flavor profile, a whole new organoleptic properties. Kibble really doesn't taste and feel like fresh food, and vice versa. So you do want to give them time to go through that adaptation process.
And my next thing is for any pet parents that have gone to the vet and their dog unfortunately has been diagnosed with cancers, how do they actually get into the actual system of being part of the sanctuary?
Sure. I mean, the first step is always, just give me a ring or a text, or we're on Facebook, or you can go to the website. And we generally try to be very, very responsive, because oftentimes when people are reaching out, it's because there's a problem.
Right.
And so that's really the first step. But it should be said that there are vets out there now who are incorporating ketogenic meal programs into their oncology practice. They're few and far between, but it is slowly but surely happening. And I will say this: it's always worth talking to your veterinary oncologist about this, because we're not at a stage now where this is a normative practice in veterinary medicine. And, again, in the interest of transparency and disclosure, some vets take a dim view of this, and they do have some legitimate reservations about it. And it is worth talking to your vet about that, getting their perspective, getting their opinion, and then weighing that and making a choice about ultimately how you want to proceed.
I'm going to say it. I'll say it on record, Daniel. You're an intelligent man. I'm absolutely just amazed in your intelligence. It is just, I can see why you're the president of KetoPet. I really can. I want to just sit here for the next, I don't know how many days, and just learn everything that's in your head, because man, it's definitely, it's going to take me a while. The only other thing I have to say is, what have we missed? What have we not talked about that is key to this conversation?
Well, I'll say this. This really is like a rabbit hole, and once you go down it, it's deep. And I think you're right. We could spend, hours together here, just talking through all the nuances. But if there's one key takeaway in all of this, is to what I like to call inverting the model of nutrition, right? Mm-hmm. So most people, when you talk about nutrition, they'll say, well, what food should I eat? Or what should I give my dog? What food should I give my dog? Right? And really what I like to do is flip that upside down. And I like to ask the question, whether it's for a doggy or person, what's your goal? What's your health goal? Mm-hmm. Right? Sometimes for people, there's a fitness goal. Sometimes for doggies, my doggies are maybe a little fluffier than they need to be. I want them to lose some weight. Or, my doggy has seizures, or my doggy has cancer. So what's the health outcome? And start with that and figure out what it is you want to do about that using nutrition. Then the next question is, what metabolic outcome do I need to achieve that health goal? Then my next question is, to get that metabolic outcome, what is the distribution of macronutrients and calories required to produce that metabolic state? And finally, what foods do I pick to comport with that macronutrient distribution and caloric density that get me that metabolic outcome, that help me achieve the health outcome that I'm ultimately shooting for? And when you start at the top of the stack with that health outcome, and then you ask yourself, what do I need to do to my metabolism or my doggy's metabolism to achieve that? What macronutrient distribution do I need to get that outcome? And finally, that narrows the choice and range of what foods you'll pick anyways, and makes that decision a lot easier. And that's not a very common way of thinking about nutrition, but I've found it to be incredibly helpful because you're beginning with the end in mind. Mm-hmm. And you're also having a conversation, whether it's with a person or a doggy, about ultimately what their goals are. And you're making an investment in that and saying, hey, look, this is really important. We should get together and help you try to achieve these goals, whether it's for yourself or your furry friend.
You actually made soapboxing, the way I always see it, sound actually better. Like, seriously, that's exactly what I try to explain. That's what I like to call soapboxing. But man, you just made that sound so much cooler. And more intelligent too. I'm sitting here going, that's pretty much the premise of what I want to do, but you have the right way of doing it. See, again, I need to sit here for days. I need to just learn everything that's in your head. So maybe I'm more, able to articulate that to the people. But you are right.
Outstanding. Well, hey, man, thank you so much. It's been super awesome to get to do this with you. It is very, very gracious and kind of you to have me on, man. And if we can swing it, maybe there's a part 2 in the future.
You know what? That's usually my line, and that's exactly how I was going to end it.
All right. Well, take care, man. Thank you so much.
There he is, Daniel Orrego, KetoPet president for a reason. And that reason is obvious. He's a brilliant man, as you all just heard. There's not much I can actually add to end this episode besides saying it's obvious why KetoPet is leading the way. Why everybody says what they're doing, the knowledge, the science, everything is top notch. You heard him. He's got every answer and articulately can just lay it out there. It was so easy for him to just sit here and be able to tell us all about what we, not only as pet parents, but as just health conscientious people, are to be doing. And I mean, I wish I could say I was as in depth and fulfilling every bit of my nutrition as well as he is. I'm sadly not. And I don't even know if any of us really are. He's a specimen. That's the best way of putting it, folks. A specimen of its own. And I think we can all agree, brilliant, and we all kind of want to be a lot like him. At least I could say I do. So I want to thank you again, Daniel, for being on the podcast. I know that we will talk again very soon, and it's been a pleasure. Next week, I might change it up a little bit. We might do a video podcast. We might actually do another audio podcast. I don't know. I've got a lot of things planned for the podcast, and I actually look forward to sharing with you. That's the best part of doing this. So with that said, I'm Chris Green. Have a pet-tastic week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, gotta go in my bedtime.